Hello, sweet friends. Today we are going to make this darling summer quilt by Poppie Cotton called Sunshine in a Pot. The fabric line used in this pattern is called Promise Me by Poppie Cotton, and it is just the cutest garden prints with tules and flowers and strawberries, and it's even got little clovers with ladybugs, and it's got little daisies with bumblebees. I mean, what's not to love? Now, this is a little different project than we usually do in this format, but I'm taking this on as a personal challenge because this pattern calls for a fat quarter bundle in order to do all of these patches and flowers. But I was looking through the pattern, and I think you can do this with a set of 10-inch squares. So I just happen to have a set of 10-inch squares of Promise Me by Poppie Cotton, and I think we should give it a go. What do you think? Because if we can do this with the 10-inch square pack instead of a fat quarter tower, that is going to be like 1/3 the cost, and it will also save time. Because basically you need a square for the petals, a square for the center, and a square for the pot. So I'm going to go through this pile and pull out all the pieces that I think will look great together. Okay, and there are all our sets. Now, to the best of my ability, I tried to keep them the same as what's in the picture, but of course you can mix it up however you like. But I wanted to make sure that what you saw on the picture is what you could make. With just a couple of exceptions, for example, this red right here is used 3 times, so you can't get all 3 of those out of just the 2 squares. You would need 3 squares. The same thing is true with the yellow daisies with the bumblebees. It's used in 3 places as well, so I had to substitute another yellow. But otherwise, I think it looks really close, and you have all of these squares left over, so you can also do a little more mix and matching if you like. All right, well, let's get to cutting. I have this really adorable little dot. It's got the perfect green. Look at that. It matches perfectly. So I'm going to use this little scattered dot for the background. Now, if you would like to join us in this little mini sew along, you will need to purchase the pattern for the fabric requirements and cutting that you can find at www.thequilterscandyshop.com. That's SHOPPE shop.com, and we have this pattern in stock right now. Now, let's get on to sewing something sweet. The pattern's great because it's got some general information like how to do stitch and flip corners, and then of course it has all the information for how to make the blocks, and it actually gives you a template for the terracotta pots and a really nice step-by-step instruction on how to bind your quilt. So I thought this was good, all good information, and this is included in the pattern. All right, let's start with the background fabric. Here's a little tip for beginners. This pattern calls for 4.5 yards. And so when you go to your quilt store to buy the backing fabric and you get 4.5 yards, that's going to be way too much to handle working on a table. So what I do is when I get home, I put the 4.5 yards to the side and I cut off myself a yard. I just cut one big chunk off. It doesn't have to be exactly a yard, but I just cut off a chunk that then I can manipulate more easily on my cutting board and in my workspace. So when you go to the store, buy yourself an extra 9 inches. Generally speaking, that'll get you an extra cut off of something in case you make a mistake. And then you've got this piece that's really easy to manipulate and work on your work table. And when you're done with this one, you can go and cut off another hunk to work with. If you haven't done a sew along online before, I just want for a little clarity to make sure you understand, I'm not going to give you exact measurements as we go along because I need to protect the integrity of the pattern copyright. So you do need to purchase the pattern to get the actual yardage quantities and the cutting instructions for the particular sizes. But you'll get the general idea, and when you have the pattern in front of you, it's going to be really obvious. Regardless of which order they might be on the instructions, I always start with the biggest cuts first. If for some reason you didn't listen to me and you didn't buy extra, and you get down to the end and you don't have enough, when you go back to the store, you only want to have to purchase the smallest amount necessary, not the largest. Number one. And number two, if you cut your largest pieces first, a lot of times you can get smaller pieces that are required off the ends of those cuts, thereby making your use of your fabric much more efficient. Before we do any cutting, we're going to have to straighten up this edge, and I am a big fan of the 2-ruler method. So you take a good square. It doesn't have to be a 12.5 inch, but the longer the line is along the bottom, the more accurate you're going to be. And you're going to line up a line along the bottom of your folded fabric. And then you're going to need a second ruler, usually something a little narrower so you get a good grip on it. And you put that here, get a good grip on your ruler. Now I like to use my little pinky on the outside edge of that ruler so it won't slip away, and 2 fingers pressing down. You slide your big ruler away and cut, and that's going to give you the best starter cut. The pattern calls for 13 of these border stripes, and I have done the math, and that is not enough. You actually need 23 cuts of this width of strip to get all of the borders, sashings, and squares that are required. The good news is that the yardage amount is correct, so you will have enough background to make all 23 cuts. And there we go. I'm going to cut the rest of these strips, and I'll be right back. And here I've come to the end of my chunk, and I still have more border strips to cut, but I don't have enough fabric here to make a border strip cut, so I'm checking the pattern. 13, 4.5 and strips. Yes, I have a couple of smaller strips that I need to cut that will fit right here. And now I can subcut a few of the smaller pieces I need before getting another chunk of my large background yardage to continue cutting my border strips. So nothing was wasted, and it was much easier to handle the fabric in the smaller hunks. Another great tip is to use some sort of markers for your squares. You can use them a couple of different ways. One is, of course, just marking the pieces, the letters that they gave. For example, these little squares are supposed to be I, so I can put this right here, and I know all of these squares what their measure is. However, I'm going to be cutting these squares a few times instead of having to count this pile every single time I add to it. I'm going to use my numbers here so I know how many are in here. So there's 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. So I have 12. I have 12 squares in here and I need 16, but I'm going to cut those last 4 off of a different piece. So I'm just going to set that aside and I'll get more in a little bit. You do not have to buy these. You can make your own with post-it notes and pins, and that works great. It just takes a little time out of my sewing to make up these little tabs, so I like this. And I admit it took me a long time to get to using some sort of marker, but I really do like it now. So I have these available in my shop at thequilterscandyshop.com, or there's a whole lot of different varieties that you can buy online, or like I said, you can make your own. So don't spend money you don't have, but this does make your life a little easier. And now I'll just continue cutting all the additional pieces I need for the background, and then we'll go on to the next step. The next thing to do in the background is to cut these 2 templates. So I'm going to take and make a photocopy of this template. I just made my copy on some cardstock. You can make it on regular paper. You can make multiple copies because you're going to cut multiple times. So we need 8 pieces of template 2 and 8 pieces of template 3 to go on the side of our terracotta pots in our pattern. So I'm going to get out my paper scissors. No using good scissors for your paper templates. And I'm just going to rough cut these apart. I've seen a lot of people make their copy on regular paper and then get a piece of cardboard and glue it on to that. And that works really slick too. Here's the remaining bits of my background fabric. Now, this and this are exactly the same, except they are reversed. You can really use these as your first pattern and then your backup if you mess up your template. So I have this folded twice. I have 4 layers. That is going to give me 2 of this and 2 of this. So I'm going to put it right down here. Here's my secret weapon. I love double-sided tape. So I'm just going to stick just a couple small dots. All it has to do is anchor your template. It doesn't have to hold it tight and secure because you're going to be moving it around. And that's only going to last a few times, but it really does work for the time being. So I'm going to put this right here. Look at that. Now see, my template doesn't slide around. And I can use my ruler along that cutting line. Just like that. I try to cover the whole cutting line. I'd rather have a little bit extra than not enough. I don't want my pieces to get too small. I don't want my pattern to get too small. I don't want my pieces to get too small. It's much easier to accommodate for a slightly large piece than for a slightly small piece. Now you have to get this little angle right here. Most times you don't have to use a ruler to get it, but this has got a big enough slice that I'm going to use my ruler to get that piece. And here, I want those to be just the right angle because they're going to really help line this up when you go to put this on your piece. And there you go. So there is 2 left and 2 right. and I need 8 of each. So my sticky tape is still good. I'm going to stick this right down here. I'm going to now put this right on this line. There'll be one less line I have to cut. Position your ruler so the dotted line is on the inside edge of the ruler. Don't cut off the dotted line. You will need it to cut the next set of templates. This way you're preserving the template to always be the correct size. Okay, I'm going to finish cutting out the background pieces and the templates, and I will meet you on the other side. Okay, and there it is, my last set. And as you can see, I did all my sets are done with just this one template 2. I still have my template 3. I'm going to put these back into the pattern and maybe I'll make this quilt again. Okay, here we go. These are all the background bits. As I was cutting the backgrounds, I did find a couple of errors in the pattern. Nothing too extraordinary, but I do recommend that whenever you're using a pattern, before you start, go to the manufacturer's website and look for their pattern corrections, because we're all human and it happens. If you buy a kit of this from our shop, we will include the pattern corrections that I have found. Let's get on to cutting the fat quarters. While I have been cutting my backgrounds, I've had plenty of time to think about how I'm going to make this all come together. And I think what I'm first going to do is cut out all of the flower pots. I don't think I'm going to be able to get any of the scrappy squares out of what's left. So the first thing I did is I separated out. This is all of the ones that are going to be the centers. These are all the ones that we pulled aside for the petals. And these are all the squares we pulled aside for the pots. Now I want to make sure, because some of these are directional prints, like these two, for example, they're directional prints. So I want to make sure that these are all going the right direction. I'm going to stack up and try and keep them in the right order so that I don't have to try to figure out what goes with what later. This one, I think technically is not directional, but there's an awful lot of these roses where the stems go one way, so I'm going to call that directional. And this print is a little tonal, and I was surprised to see it is directional. These little flowers grow this way, so we're going to make sure that's right. We've got more of these garden prints that are directional, so I'm just going to go through and make sure, because see, even these strawberries are directional. But this one is not. So I would say it's about 50-50. I'm going to turn this sideways so I can put this line right on the edge and I can see it. Just trim this down a little bit better so I have a little better vision of where my edges are. Don't want to make a bad cut. I don't have a square to spare. Okay, this makes me feel better. Get out my secret weapon right up in this point. Right up in this point, because we don't want those to shift. And down here. All right. Just like that. Make sure you've got the right size ruler. You want to get a ruler that is going to cover the distance that you got to go. Doesn't matter if it doesn't go all the way off the fabric, but it just needs to cover all of your template from at least in the area where you're going to cut. All right, so let's do this first. And I want to try to move this as little as possible. So I'm going to slide this over here, cover up that dotted line, my cutting line. And I could cut this all the way off, but since I'm going to see if I can stick a square in here, I don't know what I'm going to have or not have left. So I'm just going to go to off of the paper. Same with here. Now I know I told you don't cut under your arm, but in this case I want to be able to see everything and I don't want to have to move my fabric around. So I'm going to do that. Just like that. And I'll make this cut right here. Now, keep in mind, I'm cutting on the other side of the dotted line now, so I want to be able to see the dotted line outside of my ruler. So I'm going to go from here all the way off. And now I have these little corners, and these are smaller than the other ones, so I'm just going to cut right across like that. Like that. And like that. Okay. There we go. I feel good about that. All right, there's 4 of them. I'm going to do it one more time with the second half of the pack. Okay, my tape is still good on the back, so just going to put the second stack here, and remembering my directional fabric, so I'm going to turn it this way, sideways. Line up my template right there. I think that worked pretty well. Now all I have to do is get the little corner points. And this is really important. I used to not trim these off, but they really are like little markers that'll help to make sure that you've got these weird angled bits and pieces lined up in the right place. So go ahead and trim those off. All right, there we go. Super simple. So if you ever thought working with templates was too hard and you keep passing on patterns that have templates in it, now you can see how easy it is. Think of all the opportunities in quilting that just opened up for you. Well, the pots are cut. I'm going to go ahead and cut the stems and set those aside because that'll be fast and easy. And then we'll go on to the next thing. As I mentioned, the pattern calls for you to mix this up with 4 different prints, but I think because we're using such a small amount of fabric, 10-inch squares instead of fat quarters, I'm just going to take all of my stems out of one fabric and leave the other greens to go in the scrappy squares. And I like this one, so that's what I'm going to do. Okay, I've got my 8 stems cut. Now we'll get on to the fun part, cutting out the flowers. Okay, here's all the fabric for the flower. And I just finished cutting the petals out of my squares that I had set aside, and I forgot to turn on the video. So suffice it to say, there's plenty of fabric in one square to get the petals. So I'm sure you guys are all smart cookies, and if you follow directions step by step, you can see it's all going to come out just fine. But the only thing that's left is this size square, and this is not big enough to make any of these scrappy squares. So this is just going to have to get set aside. I think we have plenty of fabric in the leftover stack right here, and all of this will get cut to make the scrappy squares. I could go ahead and sew flowers together and then wait till the end to cut all of the scrappy squares. But because when I chain piece, I like to use a cottontail or a thread saver, if I cut all of these now, I can use those as my thread saver, and I will be sewing all the parts at the same time without wasting any time in between. I'm going to set these aside and go ahead and cut my scrappy squares. I need 80. That's a lot. I'm going to start with my scraps to see if there's anything here big enough for me to get a square out of. These are not going to be big enough. I don't think there is. Let's just take a look, see. No. So these will all have to go aside in my scrap pile. This is what's left over from cutting the center, and I do believe I can get what I need out of this one. Yes. And I am going to get my markers out so I know how many are in this pile as I add on. And this is what's left over from my stems. And this is not going to be big enough, so I'll put that in my scraps. So I've added 2 more. My numbers don't go up to 26, so I like to be a little creative, and I just cover up that 4 with a 6, and now I know I've got 26 in there. Okay, well, I got 26 squares out of my scraps from the squares that I already cut for the petals, the centers, the stems, and the pots. The rest need to come out of here. And if I did my math correctly, I need to cut another 54 squares. I have restacked my remaining layer cake squares into groups of 5 to 6 for easy cutting. I am going to continue cutting my scrappy squares out of these groups, and when I have all 80 cut and ready to go, I will meet you right back here. And there's my last 10. So now I have 80. And we did it! And look, this is what we have left. It's not very much, but certainly plenty to feel comfortable to say that you can do this pattern, the full quilt, out of a 10-inch square pack instead of fat quarters, and that's going to cut your cost by 1/3. I will have 10-inch square packs of Promise Me available in the shop, as well as the pattern if you'd like to join in. You can also pick up a full kit, including the darling speckled background and binding, or you can definitely make this from scraps out of your own stash. I think this is turning out so cute already, and I haven't stitched a thing. So join me next week for some great tips as we assemble our Sunshine in a Pot quilt just in time for summer vacation and visitors. Thanks for joining us at the Quilter's Candy Shop. We really appreciate you being here. We'll see you next week. Bye!